Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, strap on your proton pack as Finn Wolfhard, Mckenna Grace and Paul Rudd starring Ghostbusters Afterlife. Callie Spengler, played by Carrie Coon, moves her children Trevor, played by Finn Wolfhard, and Phoebe, played by Mckenna Grace, to Somerville, Oklahoma, where she has inherited a farmhouse from her absent father Egon. Phoebe and Trevor soon begin to uncover aspects of their grandfather's ghost-busting past, and start to realise that Somerville is a hub of supernatural activity regularly rocked by mysterious, unexplained earthquakes. Together with teacher Gary Gruberson, played by Paul Rudd, and New Friends podcast, played by Logan Kim, and Lucky, played by Celeste O'Connor, Phoebe and Trevor create a new ghost-busting team as they uncover Egon's past and the town's dark secrets. Last time we saw the Ghostbusters, it was the 2016 reboot where they were fighting all manner of nastiness, and that was off the screen. Admittedly, I wasn't the hugest fan of that movie myself, but there were some things to like about it, particularly in its 3D presentation, which was amusingly gimmicky, but it was absolutely bogged down by tedious, unfunny ad-lib sessions, not to mention the movie was covered in toxic pink slime for months before it even released. So that has been effectively brushed under the carpet, and now we've got what is a new sequel to the 80s movies, and the Ghostbusters franchise is back in the hands of a Reitman. Ivan Reitman directed the two 80s movies, his son Jason directs Afterlife, which is already something of a curious factor, because up until this point, Jason Reitman has largely made his name making adult-skewed comedy dramas. In fact, Up in the Air is probably one of my favourite films in general, but Jason Reitman has definitely been off the boil now for quite some time, with maybe the exception of Tully, and his most recent film before this, The Front Runner, was a tedious bore. Although Jason Reitman has definitely had a fairly uncomfortable relationship with the franchise. You can actually find old interviews with him where he says, "I'm not interested in directing a Ghostbusters sequel because that would probably be the most boring thing in the world," which is words that might come back to haunt you in some ways. Nevertheless, he's stressed how much this is meant to be a love letter to his father, who was apparently on set and giving advice to his son a lot of the time, and the movie is definitely positioned as being a tribute to the fans, which is perhaps understandable given that Jason Reitman himself has grown up with the franchise. He appears in Ghostbusters 2 at the birthday party, telling the Ghostbusters just how much they suck. But still, it definitely seems like this is a pretty severe course correction, not just for the franchise, but for Jason Reitman's career. But they're hoping that they can maybe recapture some of the spirit of the original, and I don't think they've managed to trap it here. Admittedly, at first, it looks like the franchise is heading somewhere different, not just figuratively, but literally, because this is the first one that's set outside of New York, so already it feels somewhat unique in that respect, but there's enough pulled from its predecessors that feels comfortingly familiar. In fact, there's some things pulled from the 1984 film that I've definitely missed from subsequent iterations. In particular, Elmer Bernstein's score, which is extensively sampled here, and I would argue is one of the trademark elements of the original film, and was sorely missed in the 1989 sequel, where they changed composers, and as such, I feel like they lost some of the personality of the original film in that process. Here, having it restored and combining it with the fact that Reitman directs the first half of this movie in a fairly low-key, slow-burn way, I actually caught myself thinking, this feels a lot more like the 1984 Ghostbusters than the franchise has been for a very long time. And I did wonder, has Reitman cracked it? Especially because it has this very kind of slow mentality, and then it will jolt you with a jump scare, and I was surprised at how full-throated the horror elements are in this film. Reitman isn't trying to downplay them in favour of the comedy or trying to make it kid-friendly, and I think he understands that Ghostbusters does have to be a little bit scary at times. And I also thought that the family dynamic that the film centres on had a lot of promise. In particular, Mckenna McKenna Grace is really strong as Phoebe Spengler. In fact, it's genuinely uncanny at how much she manages to kind of incorporate Harold Ramis's performance into her own. She really, really studied those films, and you can tell just all the little mannerisms and tics that Ramis has are really there, but it's not an impersonation. It feels very natural, and she's just very likeable. It proves why McKenna Grace is one of the rising stars of the future, because she's so good in this movie that she effectively carries it. There's actually quite a few laughs from the fact that Phoebe is a social misfit. She doesn't know how to communicate with people, and there's a running gag about the fact that she doesn't know how to tell a joke, which ironically is some of the funniest stuff in the movie. And because Grace really nails that very straight-laced, very deadpan delivery that Ramis had, there's something quite charming about it. I think that she is really the heart of this movie, and the filmmakers understood that because they put so much of the focus squarely on her. If she wasn't in this film, I think it would collapse, honestly, because the rest of the Spengler family, I feel, are a little bit undercharacterized. Finn Wolfhard has her older brother Trevor. He gets a job at a diner. It feels like that character has largely been consigned to the cutting room floor. There are stretches of the movie where he just disappears in his particular plot line, and honestly, he doesn't really get a whole lot to do. He's meant to be a sort of wisecracking character, but mostly he's just kind of an annoying teen a lot of the time. And Carrie Coon as their mother, Callie, her relationship with her father is definitely bitter, to say the least, and the movie definitely does this without any subtlety. It feels like every time that Callie walks into a scene, her dialogue is usually along the lines of, "Sorry, I'm so angry, I hate my father so much," which maybe dial it down a little bit, and considering that Jason has said that this is meant to be a tribute to his father, this very dysfunctional family dynamic, exacerbated by the fact that Callie feels somewhat isolated from her own daughter, that definitely reads a little bit strangely when you consider that. But again, while I think that Callie and Phoebe are perhaps the only two of the Spenglers that actually get a proper arc, unless you count fixing a car as one, I feel like Kun in particular definitely gets underserved by the material. She's kind of sidelined for most of the movie, even though she's ostensibly the top billed star. But that underutilization applies to a lot of the cast, including, surprisingly, Paul Rudd, who you would think would be a perfect fit for this franchise. The way his Mr. Gruberson enters into the movie, it's got a very Peter Venkman style vibe, in the way that he's a teacher that doesn't actually teach. All he does is show 80s horror VHSs of Cujo and Child's Play to keep his pupils amused while he actually goes about his work. And there's a kind of reckless, immature quality that is again very Venkman-like. But he's also meant to be something of a stand-in for fans of the franchise, because he's the character that recalls the events that happened in New York back in 1984, and he remembers the Ghostbusters, and seeing things like the Trap, he definitely gets excited about that. And yet, despite the fact the movie clearly positions him as an heir apparent, Rudd is actually in this movie far less than you would expect him to be. Often, he's largely sidelined. He gets a romantic subplot with Callie, but honestly, he just kind of pops in and out of this movie. And that's a shame, because Rudd, as ever, he's charming and likeable, and he's occasionally funny. He gets a good wisecrack, but honestly, it feels like it largely wastes him, which is a real big disappointment. However, the film does start to improve once it starts moving its kid Ghostbusters into place, particularly with the arrival of Logan Kim's podcast, which on paper sounds absolutely terrible. Oh, a kid named Podcast because he has a podcast? Seriously? In 2021? And yet, Logan Kim actually managed to perform a minor miracle by making this character kind of charming. I like the scenes that he has with Grace in particular, the characters have definitely been designed to be analogues of their 1984 counterparts. So Phoebe is Egon, Trevor is Venkman, and Podcast is meant to be Ray. And the film also has its own Winston in the form of Celeste O'Connor's Lucky, who is introduced as Trevor's love interest working at the diner. But if anything, the film actually not only replicates a major fault from the original film, it exacerbates it, because Winston was a character that was sidelined in the original. He didn't appear until late into the film, and he's often overlooked. And yet, Ernie Hudson's performance in that film is so great that he is still a core part of the Ghostbusters, and he still has some memorable lines and moments. That is not a privilege that is afforded to O'Connor. Her character barely does anything. The movie constantly shuttles her off screen at the first immediate opportunity, and when she even comes remotely close to doing anything, yeah, it turns out Lucky might actually be an ironic name because she's pretty much useless. Also, the movie introduces the idea that she is the sheriff's daughter, which you would think would actually go somewhere, especially considering they cast Bokeem Woodbine as her dad, and yet, despite that, he's only in one sequence of the movie and never appears again. Not once. Just disappears out of the movie. And this actually calls attention to something much larger, in my opinion, with the film, in that the nostalgic setting of Somerville is a bit of an odd place to set a Ghostbusters movie in some respects, and it does feel like it owes a particular debt to Stranger Things, especially in the way that kind of harkens back to this 60s/80s Americana that never really truly existed except in fantasy movies and kind of Spielbergian fare, which this is in some ways trying to harken to. There are moments in this movie that feel like the Goonies. The problem is that Somerville never feels like a consistent or real place. It's the kind of locale that has both a 60s diner and a Walmart in it, and also only feels like it's populated by about 10 or so people who all suddenly disappear whenever a set piece arrives. And that's a prominent fault with the movie, because in the original film, at least it felt like New York was genuinely under threat. You saw ghosts actually harming people or threatening people in that movie. Here, the residents are almost completely oblivious to what's going on, and there's only maybe a very brief cutaway. It never feels like they're actually directly under threat from the ghosts, which, I don't know, really kind of undermines a Ghostbusters premise somewhat. However, that early promise starts to dissipate by about roughly halfway through once you realise the movie doesn't actually care about any of this. That's why it's undercooked and underutilised, because it makes it that much easier to discard later. Because basically, the only reason the characters exist is to fill placeholders in the 1984 script. Ghostbusters Afterlife is the first act of a new movie, and then 2 acts of Ghostbusters 1984. That is the sole reason it exists. To do the same thing over again in exactly the same fashion. Not even slightly different, I mean exactly. And even in the earlier stages, where I liked the movie more, that still required me to overlook the fact the film is constantly filled with references to the 1984 film. There is seldom a scene that passes. They walk into Egon's farm, and there is a stack of books piled camera high, like in the library scene, do you remember? Someone sits in a chair and hands burst out of it, like in the original movie, do you get it? And so on and so forth. These aren't Easter eggs. The whole movie is a Easter egg. It is completely hollow. Any emotional engagement the film has isn't because of the storyline that it conjures up, it's because it's deliberately playing on your memories of the original film. That is who the film is made for. It is made for the absolute hardcore fans of Ghostbusters. There is an argument that because it's centered around kids, that this is meant to open up a new younger audience to the franchise, while also cannily playing the older audience who remember being kids when the original came out and getting to see that fantasy lived out through these characters. But in actuality, it's not for a new younger audience because it's so beholden to references to a movie that is almost 40 years old at this point. The movie clearly follows in the footsteps of J.J. Abrams' reboots of Star Trek and Star Wars, but it goes to an even greater extreme than those, because literally every time a prop from the original film is pulled out, it's treated like a sacred, divine artifact where the movie slows respectfully and the score swells in anticipation, and then, when it's finally revealed, the camera lovingly lingers so the audience can soak it in and presumably cheer at the things that they already recognise. And so there are scenes in this movie that are like, they found a trap, ah! Ecto 1, ah! The suits, ah! It's like going to the Church of Ghostbusters, and the film takes this to self-parody levels, where even the most minute things get this kind of response, where Phoebe opens up one of the outfits, and out of the zipper pocket, there's a Crunch Bar wrapper. Do you remember that seminal bit of Ghostbusters lore? When they ate a Crunch Bar? In fact, topping that moment, how about the bit where they're in Ecto 1 and they open up the glove compartment, extreme close-up of a Twinkie falling out? Yes, I remember those things. You know what I want? New memories instead. But what the movie does is that it decides it's going to treat the material respectfully, and by that I mean extremely safely, by literally having the new cast say the exact same lines of dialogue from the first movie. There are whole scenes that are just verbatim exchanges of script from the first film, which, yeah, if that's what you want out of a Ghostbusters movie, just a long tribute act to the first film, then you're gonna get it in Afterlife, but honestly, I need more than that. And this feels so wrong because the original film was not this. It was irreverent. In fact, it was cynical as all hell. It proudly thumbed its nose at authority, most prominently in Walter Peck's EPA official, but also in the core premise of the fact that it's three New York schlubs setting up a business and then having to confront the apocalypse with chain-smoking sarcasm. That is why Ghostbusters works. That is its MO, and that's where a lot of the humour comes from. Ghostbusters is not Star Wars. It's not trying to take itself seriously. And yet Afterlife absolutely does. It forgets it's supposed to be a comedy a lot of the time. It barely attempts jokes. In fact, the character that's most making jokes in the movie is allegedly the one that's bad at them. And that, I think, says a lot. The fact that the movie entombs itself in its own references is why it fails to be funny. Because instead of treating its own source material with irreverence, instead it treats it like something that has to be protected at all costs, no matter what. Even to the extent where I think it actually downplays some of the elements that people would want to see in a Ghostbusters movie. I actually feel like there are more references in this movie than there are actual ghosts. Yeah, you get Muncher, which is clearly meant to be a new version of Slimer, voiced only in squeals by Josh Gad, but otherwise, there's very little actual ghost-busting action, and most of the ghosts are things that you've already seen, and the movie gets even more tethered to its predecessor, especially by the time of its finale, which, in my opinion, is a hideous misstep, and really surmises why this film does not work, in my opinion, and also doesn't really understand Ghostbusters, but also tries to use the memories that the audience has in ways that I think are quite manipulative. To go into proper detail, and I really want to, I'm going to have to require going into spoilers, so instead of going to Somerville, we're heading to Spoilerville. So here is a time code to skip to. I'll put some chapters in there as well if you want to use that. So there is one significant element that I've been avoiding talking about throughout the entirety of this review, and that is Egon, who is a big part of this movie. He's there right from the very first scene. The pre-title sequence is Egon's last stand, essentially, in that he's running away from some unseen threat. He's always cast in shadow and sometimes hidden behind pillars and other objects, but we recognise the shape, and he dies. But we know from the way the word afterlife lingers in the title card, he's definitely coming back. And the filmmakers are clearly having to wrestle with the fact that Harold Ramis has sadly passed away for many years now. And so Egon is a clear presence in this movie. He's all across his farm, both literally and figuratively. But also there's an absence there, and Egon has not been a part of his family's life either. And to a certain extent, I liked how Egon was worked into the movie. I like how he's helping the Spenglers across the narrative, a lot of the time kind of ushering them into place. He largely takes the form of a lamp, which is at least kind of playful and subtle at first, but I still have problems with the way that Egon is characterised for the plot of this movie to work. It really seems out of character for him. Why would Egon go on a singular crusade to a small town without telling any of his family or friends why or what he's doing, essentially, and doing it in a way where it feels like he's betraying them and abandoning them? It makes no sense whatsoever, and honestly, that by itself is a significant problem with the script, even if Harold Ramis was still around, because that still doesn't feel like the Egon we know. Why would he act like this in the slightest? And so that feels forced right from the outset, but then the movie tries to go even greater than that, because towards the ending of the movie, in the climax, the film decides that not only is it going to bring some ghosts back, it's going to do a bit of necromancy while it's at it, and bring Harold Ramis back to life. That's right, Harold Ramis, or a CG version of him, pops up as an actual ghost at the end of this movie to help out in the fight against the bad guys, which, yeah, that, I think, is really overstepping the mark. Okay, I know that Ramis' family was probably on board with this. They would have to be for something like this. But even so, I think we've agreed over the years, after things like Rogue One, that bringing dead actors back to life is, at best, unethical, and at worst, absolutely ghoulish, and in this case, I feel it's distinctly the latter. So let me explain this in the clearest possible terms I can. People are not props. You cannot pull out Egon and Harold Ramis like it's a sacred artifact in the same way as an Ecto-1 or a ghost trap. But that's exactly what this movie does. Ramis doesn't have any control over his appearance in this movie, or the way the character is written, or his dialogue, of which there is none, because he's dead. And bringing him back like a hologram of Tupac is absolutely shameless. I know why the filmmakers did it, because it elicited a really strong emotional response from Ghostbusters fans, seeing someone that we know is dead alongside his comrades. But you know what? That elicited a really strong emotional response out of me, of disgust. The ending of this movie and its sentimentality is nauseating and calculated. It is pretty clear that this was the endgame right from the outset. And while we're on the subject of spoilers, of course, the surviving Ghostbusters, Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd and Ernie Hudson turn up at the climax. And while it is genuinely nice to see them, and they look like they're having fun getting back in the swing of things, all the movie requires them to do is just quote their past dialogue again, and that is an incredible waste of getting them all back together. Honestly, in hindsight, what the movie genuinely should have been is a passing of the torch from old to new, and making them major characters in this story all the way through, rather than just turning up as a very obvious surprise at the end. But in fact, the movie is the opposite of a torch passing, because basically all the new characters are there for is to just keep the engine running. And so the ending of the movie, where the old Ghostbusters come back and essentially take care of the problem, with the exception of Phoebe, the only new character the movie genuinely gives a damn about, it sends out a very clear message, which is basically, yeah, thanks for that, but we're taking the franchise back now. And in fact, that's only further reiterated by the fact that the two post-credit scenes are not with the new cast. They're just completely ignored and sidelined at the end of the movie. They're completely trampled by the cameo appearances. No, the two post-credit scenes are both with older cast members, and it sends out the signal that Ghostbusters' future is just going further back into its past, which perhaps is exactly the message it wants to send out. Ghostbusters Afterlife proves that this is a franchise that is haunted by its success in 1984, and yet it doesn't understand why it worked in the first place. The movie is so in love with its own mythology, it forgets to be funny. Ghostbusters is one of the most hilarious, most quotable movies of all time, and yeah, that's a high bar to clear, but Afterlife barely even tries. I doubt I remember very much about this movie, aside from that hideously misplaced finish. There are good things about this movie. Mckenna Grace, in particular, is a real standout, and Paul Rudd is always good value, even if I would have used him more here. But even so, this is a franchise that seems incredibly stagnant. Even the cartoon series has shown way more ambition than any of the live-action movies, which always seem to circle back round to 1984, with the exception of Ghostbusters 2, which at least tried to do something different, not entirely successfully, but at least it tried to be a new movie, whereas this is just literally selling you the same thing again, with just different faces on it. And on a more serious note, as if that was even possible for a movie that takes itself way too seriously, any franchise that becomes more fixated with its old mythology than trying to create something new out of the past is a franchise that becomes a ghost of itself. If you liked this review, and you probably didn't, you can buy me an Ecto Cooler over at my Ko-fi page, or you can help me bust some more cinematic ghosts over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.